Hey guys, Luke here from Ron Rohde Law. Today we're hosting this event for all these investors here. We're going to talk about doing some commercial real estate investing, underwriting, how to go about that with multifamily and triple net leases.
I really appreciate everybody coming out. My name is Ron Rohde. I'm an attorney. I practice exclusively commercial real estate, investment transactions. We do leasing. We basically support our clients through all aspects of the real estate cycle. Whether this is like a small multi, call it 80 or under is a small multi, above 100 is like a regular size multifamily versus triple net. So anything triple net is very broad, right? It's net leasing. Office, so a space like this is offered on triple net leasing. It could be warehouse, it can be industrial, it can be really any type of property can be triple net. And then there's also like the freestanding triple net retail, which is a whole separate subcategory, but that's when you think of like those Walgreens, you think of freestanding Taco Bells. Those are all sold and traded as single tenant retail triple net. What I plan to talk about then is probably primarily multifamily, and then I'll touch on triple net kind of at the end of every topic, because everything that I'm going to talk about for underwriting and looking at a deal, and then once you get under contract, I'm going to talk about really specific single examples of due diligence. Because as a law firm, if you hire a lawyer on your team and there's maybe 100 items to review, we take 30 of them. And then we do them and we handle them and we do them well. But there's 100 points of due diligence that you should check off on your own checklist before you go to closing. We'll talk about multifamily, what is on that checklist, how to underwrite, and then how that applies or how it's different from triple net, because they're similar, but all right. So I want to start from kind of a very, very high level, and that is the net operating income. I think everybody's talked about it. We all hear it and people talk about it, but I think it's probably the single most important piece of information that you should get on a property, more so than the address, more so than the size, more so than the age of the building, percentage occupancy. None of that matters. I really just care about what is the net operating income. And the reason for that is because everything drives off of this annual cash flow. So it's going to probably be presented to you from a broker or the seller in the form of a P&L. So it's like a profit and loss statement. But you as an investor, as a sponsor or as a general partner, your job is to create your own NOI. And that is a different process, I think, than a lot of people are used to. If you're coming from residential or if you're just coming from a different background, you may not know how to create your own P&L, and that's how you arrive at your net operating income. Basically, the very simple, the revenue, that's going to be your gross rent received. So for multifamily, it's typically a little bit easier because you have your base rents, and typically all of your tenants are on gross leases. So a gross lease is one where the tenant just pays a flat fee. They come in and they say, I pay $600 a month for my studio, and that's it. I get everything included in that. I don't care if your property taxes go up, if your insurance goes up, anything. It's just I pay $600 a month, and that's, people are familiar with that, and it's easier to understand, but it shifts the risk of inflation and other mismanaged costs onto the owner. And I think it's really pertinent because multifamily is a good investment, assuming you can raise your rents corresponding to your increase in costs, and hopefully, raise your rents more than your increase in costs so you make more money. But that's the starting point. So you have your gross rent at the top. You have to add other income, and this is another situation that the more you look at deals, you'll start to see what's reasonable and unreasonable, because other income can be anything. It can be reserved parking. It can be storage units. It can be late fees. It can be application. It can be pet deposits. And so there's a very wide range of the quality of income from other income. And so I say this because you're going to get a P&L and it says rent. Okay, great. That's fine. You can calculate that. You can average it per unit, look at the late fees, whatever. But the other income, that can be substantial. That could be 10 or 20% of the annual revenue. And you need to know, should I rely on that income or discount it? Right? I mean, that's just kind of the general premise, because it's 20%. It's a huge swing in NOI and a huge swing in value if their other income is all one-off, single instant income. So once you figure that out, you go to the next space, and that's expenses. So for a multifamily, you really have a different role, and your incentive is to control your expenses while still providing, the amenities and the quality of service that your tenants want. I would say the big, what do I have? I have 6 here that are kind of like your big 6 utilities. And are you guys familiar with RUBS? Do you guys know what charging back utilities? So that's a very common program to institute. It's basically you pay back for electricity usage per unit. It's usually pro rata, or it can have individual meters, say for water. There's a lot of companies out there that basically it's RUBS implementation. It's a huge project. It costs money. It's a lot of complexity. It costs accounting brain power. However, if at the end of the RUBS implementation, you basically just increased your NOI by percentages, but like 10% per unit, because now they're paying back for their water, maybe a sewer charge, and electricity. So, but you have to have a way to individually meter. Otherwise, tenants don't like it if they're just being pro rata charged for electricity. I mean, think about it from your perspective. Would you want to sign an apartment lease where it just says you owe 1/20th of the electricity use every month? So when your neighbors are all blasting AC and like leaving their windows and doors open, you have to pay for them. I think it rubs people the wrong way that they have to pay for their neighbor's waste. So you want an individual metering system, and that it can be done, but then it's a long-term investment. Repair cost, that's not as big one. You do want to look at it though, because there's a very important distinction on the repairs and maintenance versus capital expenditures. And so this is a line on the P&L that distinguishes between a one-time expense, which if you have any accountants or CPAs in here, you guys know the difference. Expenses are charges against a cash flow or a one-time charge. That's like a repair. And then a capital expenditure is an investment that is on your balance sheet, right? So it's an amortized expense over the useful life of the improvement. And why this is important is because it's very common for people to miscategorize different items both directions, right? So they may have a repair that they decide to just upgrade a unit and they can call it a CapEx. But if you look at what is being replaced, and you can figure this out by walking the property, getting receipts, getting detailed P&Ls with breakdowns. And again, every single property is going to have a different set of due diligence. And I say this because my goal in this today is for you to kind of just understand the categories and what specifically to look for. Because when you look at a deal, you're going to get crappy data that's all over the map, and you have to use your own tools to figure out how to get comfortable with each one of these major categories, and how do I create my own number based on a wide range of data. And it includes walking the property. It includes kind of talking to the tenants. It's literally like Google Maps. You go back in time and you say, hey, there was landscaping that existed in 2018. How come there's a huge landscaping expense also in 2021? I think maybe they're hiding something, or why are they expensing landscaping when it looks the same as before? So again, these are just kind of, you're kind of like a detective, and you have to figure out what the true NOI of the property is. It's the NOI that you believe it is. Property taxes, that's a big one. How many people have heard of cost segregation? Okay, so you guys are familiar. Cost segregation is basically a report. It's a section of the IRS code that allows you to depreciate the improvements of a purchase, a real estate purchase, because if you buy an apartment building for $4 million, you don't typically apportion the land versus the improvements. And in a cost segregation study, they provide all the detail to say $3 million for the land, or $3 million for the building, and $1 million for the land. And that allows you to deduct more. You take bonus depreciation. There's all sorts of complicated things that I'm not a CPA, but a cost segregation report basically splits that purchase price, and it provides justification to the IRS about why you're taking depreciation early. That was my very long segue to property taxes, and cost seg is important so that you can dispute your property taxes after you take title to the property, because it's probably the number one area where you get 80% of the bang, because your property taxes are, I guess, depending on the property, if you have payroll, other than payroll, property taxes are your single biggest expense. And so if you can, they raise your property taxes 10%, if you can bring it back 5%, that's, you know, the biggest savings to your bottom line versus trying to install low flow toilets in all your units. You know, that saves you like 1%. It's like a lot of hassle and headache to do that. Although installing something in all the units can be a really good way for you or a handyman to put eyes on every unit to see what the condition is. So I usually advise my clients, and I guess this is being recorded, but use property-wide improvements as an excuse to get into every unit, because a lot of the tenants, they don't want you in there, and if they've been there for a while, you have no idea what the condition of the unit is. People are hoarders, people are dirty, there can be mold, and you know, you would never know about it. And so if you have a opportunity with the transition to get into every unit, it's a really good excuse that is permissible in all 50 states. It's explicit in your lease. So just remember that tip if you need to get eyes into every unit. And again, you don't have to do it, but you just tell your property manager, okay, you go in to every unit and say, oh, I'm just ensuring that they installed it correctly. Walk around and give you a report on every unit and say, is any unit in really bad shape? Property management. So this is a popular topic. You know, for people that are looking at small units, I would say that you have the hardest job, because finding property management for sub 60 is the hardest job in the world. It's a little bit too big for people to self-manage, even if they have, you know, they have a day job, or even if they're handy, they know a lot of handymen and stuff. It's just a lot of units, and stuff is probably going to be breaking, and you're going to have mechanic calls every single week, but not every single day. And that's an important distinction, because when you get to above the 100 unit or 120 units, you can have a full-time property manager, and somebody that's paid, you know, $40,000 a year. They're on site. That's their job. They show up 9 to 5. They're sitting in the office. When people have concerns, they jump on it and they issue a request, and you know, they get problems taken care of immediately, same day. And you can afford that because your margins are higher and you have more base revenue to allocate a full-time property manager to that building. So like here in Dallas, if you are looking in the DFW area, there's one I know that's pretty good. It's like Indio Management. And I've worked with them on a couple of things. They're a really good shop that they specialize in the small property management for 80 units and below. And they're really good. Like they charge fair rates, and they do a good job at that price point and that size. So just a tip, if you're looking at property management, if you're thinking about self-managing, you can do it. Just understand that it's a tough, you know, it's not a 20 unit that you're going to have one problem every 2 months that you can handle. 60, 50, even 48, it's a lot of units. It's a lot of toilets, it's a lot of sinks, a lot of things to break. And again, you don't need to fix it, but you need to call somebody. He's going to give you a repair. You're going to have to approve it. You know, there's so much trust that goes on with looking and evaluating. These are decisions, right? And even if you empower your property manager, I guarantee you things will come up that are outside the scope of your pre-set of rules. Because I'll have a lot of people, again, they say, property manager, I give you authority to approve any type of repair under $500. And then they're going to come and say, okay, well, the guy came back and said it's $550. And you're like, it's fine, just repair it. And it eats away at your time. And your time is a very valuable asset. You know, you can't make more of it, and the only way to leverage it is to scale. So again, that really kind of wraps up the expense side. And what you're going to do is look at their documents, you're going to look at their P&L, and then you're going to generate your own. You're going to look at all of the utility bills. You're going to look at insurance receipts. There's a lot of information that you can create your own P&L for year one of when you own the property. So I guess, again, these are kind of some simple ones. I didn't know cap rate. Everybody's familiar with cap rate, how you calculate it. And this is kind of the obvious explanation of why it's so important, just because of leverage, just because you're getting a lot more bang for your buck. For every dollar of NOI that you increase, you can get 5 times $7 back on value. Let's see. So the difference in evaluating the P&L for a triple net property, now this is something a little bit different. So here I'm going to show you on the income side, this is for triple net. You have income, you're going to have your rent, and you're going to have reimbursable expenses, and then you're going to still have your other income in here. And this is really important now because it's complex. And if you have a multi-tenant building, you may have $100,000 in rent, and your expenses, let's say your property taxes are $50,000. Your income on a 50% occupied building, you're only going to get $25,000 in reimbursable expenses, just on this simple example, right? Let's say this is a net lease, which is just a single N, not a net. That's a triple net. This can just be a single net lease where they're only responsible for reimbursing for property taxes. This is common. I mean, this is out there. But you can see how it creates kind of this, there's no assumptions with a triple net leasing. Because if you looked at this and you say, okay, their income is $100K, here's their other, expenses. This property tax. They may have some utilities, they may have marketing, admin. You might be tempted to just look at this, subtract these amounts, and you end up at an NOI, but it's not true. If you have vacancy on any type of triple net property, this is true for office, this is true for retail, you have to understand how much of those expenses can you pass to the existing tenants and how much must be borne by the landlord. Because again, talk about this space, and I'll take a little break. So this is office, it's zoned for office or retail. I want to thank our friends eXp Realty, Daniel and Calvin. They're listing this space. It's about 4,800 square feet. It's, it was used as an office. There's a marketing company in here. It's advertised as triple net. But if you are the landlord, you have costs of vacancy right now. They have utilities on. So obviously we have the lights on. There's the AC running. You have your property taxes for this month. Because even if they signed a tenant next month and they started on December 1st, you still have the month of November prorated that you have to pay for. The owner bought this building this year. So it becomes a very difficult calculation of what are my holding costs even if I get a tenant, or even if I have a 50% occupancy, what are my holding costs between vacant utilities, marketing, tenant improvements? It just becomes very complicated, and I don't really have the focus to kind of dig into that, but I want to make you aware of some of these concerns. Again, if on a multifamily property you agree that you can't accept the seller's P&L, you can't accept the broker's NOI just as their word. You can't accept the seller's NOI on a triple net property either, but the calculation process is very difficult. And let me just add to that, it can be exacerbated by having caps. And in the lease, there are caps on the amount of reimbursable expenses that a certain tenant is required to pay. And it can be something like a 2% increase. So if you charged him $25,000 for all reimbursable expenses, and he has a 2% cap on increases, even if your property taxes go up, and they go up by, 20%, and they go up to $60,000, you would think that you could charge him 30 based on the lease, but it's not. You would only be able to charge, what is that, 25,500 based on that increase. And so again, it puts you at a delta as a landlord. It reduces your NOI because of the caps. And so this is kind of a segue into, reading the leases, but this is a critical example, and I would say this comes up a lot. A lot of my clients, I do a lease abstract and I give it to them and I say, oh, do you know there's a cap? There's a cap on this category of expenses. There's no cap on this category. There's recapture too. So sometimes if it goes up to 30,000, they only can charge 26, 27, and they can recapture it back so that if the property taxes go down, they can charge, they can go up to the 30,000, but you're limited in time. So only for 3 years you can capture back what they owed you, right? So they have that delta of $4,000. They can recapture it in the next couple of years if the property taxes stay at 60. So it's very, yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is the triple net, maybe with multiple tenants scenario?
Yeah, so call it like 2 tenants, 50% occupied, and they have a cap on their reimbursable expenses.
So the cap not just on the rent increase, but on the reimbursable expenses.
Yeah.
But I thought the whole point of triple net is to build back everything.
Yeah, it depends on the lease, but it's build back everything is ideal for the landlord with no caps. But strong tenants will say, I want a cap, because, and also too, it depends on how you structure or how you manage the expenses. But tenants, since their incentive is to reduce their expenses, they usually want rights to challenge your property taxes. They want to protest. They also want to get you additional quotes on insurance. So you can't just go and get, the Cadillac of insurance. They say, well, that's the Cadillac, but I can get it cheaper. I want you to buy this one. And the landlord, we're indifferent. As long as you meet our criteria, AAA, standard best, 5 million coverage, whatever, as long as it meets the policy requirements, which again, I'm sure spelled in the lease, you can let the tenant do that. But I would say that caps are very common right now in retail because of the environment. The good tenants have more leverage. So if you're multiple locations, if you have a strong corporate record, and let's say you're I don't know what's trendy right now, but if you're a franchise corporate guaranteed boba shop, you're kind of desirable for certain areas. And if you have that track record of like Kung Fu Tea, we come in and we don't default, they can argue for a cap. And it's just important for you to understand how complicated it can be, and you don't know until you look at the leases, because everybody can ask for it. The landlord doesn't have to give it to you.
So our big triple net tenants, they come with their own leases? Because usually landlords. Landlords typically provide it.
I would say it's pretty rare that a tenant provides a lease unless it's somebody like Amazon. So I did work for Amazon. They provide their own lease because their people like them. I don't know why, but they like them as a tenant. So they let the tenant provide the lease. All right. So I'll pivot back to multifamily. I want to talk a little bit about leases on the multifamily property. This is, again, a single area that 90% of the time, it's not an issue, right? We're using typically promulgated forms, not from a state, right? No state governments produce the forms. These are all private groups that if you're a member, you can access these promulgated forms. But I hear that a lot. People say like, well, I'm going to buy this apartment and just use standard forms. There's really still no such thing as a standard residential lease for an apartment. But to the extent that they're all identical, that's good. That makes your job easier. But I would say 90% of the multifamily we'll look at, the leases are identical, but there's 10% where they're not. And what I mean is people will scratch out things and they'll handwrite an amendment. And these are perfectly valid. These are initialed by both parties. They consented to whatever this addendum or modification is. And it's critical that you catch that. Because I would really say, our job as a lawyer is reviewing things, checking off a checklist so that 90% of the time, nothing is out of the ordinary. But on a commercial deal, when you're talking millions of dollars for a purchase price, hundreds of thousands of your own equity, how is it not worth it to check it for the 10% or the 5%? You know, depending on the size of the deal, we do some 20, 25, 29 million dollar multifamily. You run down every little possibility, because even if there's a 0.1% chance, I don't know what that is out of 29, but it's a significant amount of equity, and you're basically negligent to your investors if you had an opportunity to check something and you didn't, and it ends up costing you guys money, right? So that's for leases. I would say, again, that's something of that 100 due diligence checklist. My clients are perfectly capable of doing it, and it's really just a question of time. If you're buying 100 leases, do you have the time to go through them within the due diligence period? Do a lease abstract. We do lease abstracts, which basically take a 30-page lease and distill it into 2 or 3 pages. So do you have the time, or do you have the money, you know, just to pay somebody else to review it? Let's see. So that's leases. Okay, do you guys have questions about kind of what we covered so far? No questions. You guys are ready to write offers, huh? All right. Okay, well, I'll talk about another trick that I look for on multifamily properties. So this has been a little bit difficult during COVID, but in normal times, you get a snapshot, which is a single point in time of the accounts receivable, right? And everybody knows this is how much is delinquent rent. So if you're looking at Class C, Class B, even some Class A properties, they have some delinquency. But you want to know how many tenants are late and how many are on the verge of being evicted. And you can't always get that, because an accounts receivable is a snapshot. It says, like, as of November 11th, $5,000 is 30 days late, and $1,000 is 60 days late. That's all it tells you as of this time. It doesn't tell you what the accounts receivable was 3 months ago. They may have had 10,000 that was 60 days late, and then they write it off, and it disappears, you know, from the AR. And so one thing I look for is spikes in legal expense, which typically will indicate that they hired a lawyer to pay for an eviction. And so it's not like a common question. I certainly don't see it where you can say, seller, how many evictions have you had in the past 12 months? Like, that's not a piece of the due diligence directly. And even then, I feel like they would lie, or they would get around it. Because you can start the eviction, you don't have to, you can stop it at lots of points. So how do you define eviction? But if they're paying a lawyer $1,000, $1,500, it's for an eviction. If they're paying $5,000, that's for like 7 or 8 evictions. So it's a really good informal proxy. I can't always tell you like when it was impacted, but I've looked at 12 T12s that have a spike, they have flat spike and a spike, and I say this is a lot of evictions. This is probably representing 24 units, just roughly. And if you're looking at a 100-unit property, you're like, wow, that's a lot. That's 25% of that property has been evicted, not just turnover, but had to be evicted. So it just gives you insight into the quality of the tenants, the turnover, and is that a risk that you're willing to take? Because if they're priced right, if it's offered at a 12 cap, well, you know why? Because he has horrible, crappy tenants that don't pay, and they have to get evicted because they won't leave. And again, everything is just kind of like a risk reward, and you have to understand, what am I willing to do to get my cash flow? You know, the riskier properties, the more difficult they are, multi-tenant to some degree, they get a higher cap rate because it's just more to manage. And you can look at it as risk diversification. So maybe you want to pay more for multi-tenant, or maybe you want to pay less because it's multi-tenant and you got to manage 16 different small bay warehouse tenants that maybe need to be evicted. Again, economies of scale, I talked about that. Another good question, I think everybody wants to do this, right, is buy Class B, Class C, value add, renovate the units, kick out the bad paying tenants, raise the rents, increase your NOI by 10, 15, 20,000, and, you know, cash out, right? It's a really good idea in theory, but I will say that it's a little bit late in the cycle, because Everybody on the internet talks about it. All the gurus, everybody is pitching like, this is how you do value add multifamily. And if I had $1 for every potential client, like you guys here that call me and say, I want to do value add multifamily, I want to buy in these markets and then sell and exit in 2 years, less than 2 years, I wouldn't be a lawyer. I would be retired. But that's not to say you can't do it, right? There are some people that are doing it. I think what you have to understand is if you're competing against everybody in this room right now, I will assume all of you have the same amount of capital. Everybody has the same access to capital. You're talking to the same investors. The debt is all there. There are plenty of passive investors that want to be LPs with you. Everybody's on equal footing in that regard. What makes you unique? Are you going to pay more for the property? Are you going to raise rents more than the other person, which enables you to pay more for the property up front? But how are you going to win those deals? Because it's a very competitive environment. And I'll tell you, we have sellers that get 20 offers on their property. They'll send 5 to best and final, but you don't want to be, one of the 20 that's just kind of like not competitive. I think you really have to understand what risk are you taking that makes you unique. And maybe you have a construction background. Maybe you can do your renovations at a lot lower price point. I don't know. Maybe you can offer technology like digital keypads or, package scanning. I don't know, whatever it is that you can offer that you think will be successful, that makes you unique from everybody in this room. That's what you have to like really lean into. And I say that not to be flippant, but it's really important in this environment. You cannot be like everybody else doing the same underwriting, projecting the same rents and projecting the same increases, because somebody out there is more aggressive than you and they're just willing to overpay. And they're paying cash too. So it's kind of like, what is your advantage? And I think some of those answers can be, like I said, the construction, the tenant base, the management, smaller markets. So a lot of the bigger players, they're not going to go into tertiary markets. So even within Texas, I think that would be like, not Denton. Denton's not anymore, but like Waco is definitely considered a tertiary market. Temple, any of these towns that you guys drove through between Houston, Austin, and Dallas that's not in the city. If you can't see the skyscrapers of Dallas, you're pretty far away. You're probably about an hour away. And that's scary. A lot of investors won't put their money in those markets because there's fewer contractors, there's fewer property managers, there's fewer banks, there's, just everything is a little bit harder to do. And that can be your advantage, is that you're willing to go to, Bay City, Texas, or outside Galveston, and you're willing to buy a property there and pay what you consider, what they consider is high, maybe like a 6 cap, but you're saying, hey, it's a deal because everything else I'm looking at is trading in the 4s. I can buy it at a 6 and sell it at 5.7, something like that. And if you believe that and you can put it into practice, that's going to give you an advantage to win these deals. So I just think that's important, because sometimes people formulate a plan in a vacuum. And no matter what you guys are thinking now, you've got to bounce it off, I guess, other people for real world feedback, because the plan is not bad in and of itself. It sounds great on paper, but if you talk to me, I'll say it's not going to work. You can talk to a broker too, right? If you can get a real multifamily broker or somebody that knows the market, tell them your plan, find a property that they have and say, hey, if I offered this, do you think it would be competitive? And they'll be pretty candid with you. They'll say, no, you can't offer 17 and this property is going for a minimum of 19. And you say, well, that's crazy. How are they projecting $350 rent increases? And they're like, it's the market. It's just very competitive. And you'll say, well, those guys are crazy. And that's fine. But those people are buying those deals. They're winning them. And they're raising $250. And then they're raising $400. And now they're selling for a profit. And you're on the sidelines never having done a deal. So if you're too conservative, which I don't want to make it sound bad, but if you're too conservative, you have to understand that it might take you a long time to do a deal. And that can be okay. You might wait 2 years for the right deal to fall in your lap, where you have a connection to the seller or you have some other advantage, and then you jump in and you do it and you make a lot of money, and that's fine. It's better to be more conservative than too aggressive. because you'll run out of, there's only so many times you can lose capital before you run out of reputation and money to keep investing. But you're not going to go broke being conservative. All right, so yes.
Quick question. So what are your thoughts on Estoppels versus lease agreements? What are your thoughts on that, pros and cons? Like sometimes I feel like they might actually want to lean more towards an Estoppel just to fill it in those units to get, anyone with a car seat versus lease agreements.
So explain to me what you mean by Estoppel. Explain to me what you mean by that, because I'm thinking of the legal term, but doesn't sound like how you're using it. This is a multifamily context.
Like I know in California, I don't know if it's different here. Sometimes they're off Estoppels. It's basically like a certification that these people live there and they're paying so much.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Not actually lease agreements.
So that is an Estoppel letter. So we definitely do those. For our situation, they're always in conjunction with the signed lease agreement. It sounds like so we don't typically do those. If you have occupied units, we will just kind of discount that. But it could be a good tool. The problem is there was probably a signed lease agreement at one point, and then it expired, and then that tenant went month to month. And that's usually what happens, and then the property traded hands and the lease never got transferred over. And so it poses a big risk to you as a buyer, because if you try to evict that person, they can pull out a lease, and it's the original lease, and it is still binding. And it can be tough. It's just a gamble. Like I said, we don't have that too much. I think that people, at least in Texas or in most other states other than California, we have a lot of confidence in just evicting tenants. We just hold over, right? Not even non-payment of rent, but it doesn't matter what their original lease said, we can just evict them. We'll take that risk because we can win in court. And we can win in 3 months, in worst case. So we discount and we just evict. I think that's the Texas approach, whereas in California, you can't do it. You can't do it quickly or cheaply. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. I mean, we don't do estoppels like for regular multifamily. We just demand to see the leases.
I think the only things that we do estoppels certificates for are the triple net leases.
For sure.
For apartments, we don't do that.
Yeah, and it would just be something that you negotiate into the PSA. So that's something that's really critical too, is for triple net, if you're acquiring it, everything has to be in the PSA. Because if you ask the seller for something, if it's not a obligation, they're going to tell you to pounce in. And it's an interesting situation for me as a lawyer, because I have to figure out how I can get this information, interpret a lease clause that says, well, you have to provide us this within X amount of time before closing sometimes. But yeah.
Speaking of the PSAs, so we acquired it in multiple states. So we have a broker who's licensed in multiple states. He just gets the generic one from, we don't know where, but he says he gets the generic one from the state by his brokerage. So should we because we read it, it looks good, but should we have a lawyer review the PSAs?
Yeah, look, beyond just touting my own profession, I think that the important thing for you is, do you have something to add to the PSA to tell your lawyer to look for? Because if you're not educated enough, like you've had a deal where, again, like this Estoppel situation, if you were buying a multifamily property and then you had an issue on seller representations, right? That's a big deal. And if they say something like, oh, this equipment is owned, and you say, okay, no problem. And then you go to closing and you realize that it has a lien on it, it has a financing lien, and you don't own it. The seller didn't own it. It throws off all sorts of things. If you go back to the PSA and you're like, oh man, why didn't we catch this? I want to sue them. Well, if it's not a seller representation, it'd have to be under fraud. That's like a tort theory to sue them, and it's a much higher standard versus if it's a breach of contract. And so that's a concrete example where if you've gotten burned before, I think you'll be damn sure it's in every single PSA going forward that the seller makes an affirmative representation that X, whatever, say owned equipment, something like that. But yeah, the generic is good as a starting point. But again, I have a lot of clients that come to me and they say like, can you review this PSA? Well, I'm about to sign it. I can review it for certain general things, but without having dialogue with a client of like, what's important to you? What did you negotiate with this seller? It's hard for me to negotiate something. Is it legally enforceable? Yes. And is this something that I would sign? No, but it's certainly possible for you to sign given your risk tolerance or the price, right? I have people say, I'm getting this for a really cheap deal. Ron, you can't mark up this contract too much. So I say, that's fine. I do what I can to get the deal better, but I'm not going to kill the deal because you're getting it at such a cheap price. So my answer to that question is yes, you should have a lawyer, but you should know what you want him to do. And if you don't have examples yet, I think you're kind of just, like going and waiting to get hit by something.
Right.
And then you're going to be like, oh crap, okay, now I'll do that next time.
We're trying to avoid that as much as possible, right?
For sure. And so again, I'm happy to chat with you about like, and again, it's all about your particular risk tolerances as well as the property itself, about the seller. If you have a mom and pop seller, there are different sets of concerns that you have versus buying, like an industrial property that's an owner user or something. It's just a little bit different based on who you're buying from, what you can get away with, what you can ask for. But yeah, tailoring it to every situation is probably my advice. Because when you get into those bigger price points, or you just have more deal volume, you're going to run into something eventually. It's not going to be maybe it's not your first one, maybe it's not your third or your fifth, but what point, and how much is it going to cost you on the 8th deal? You get slammed by, like those financing ones are big, title commitment. I wasn't going to talk about title and survey too much, but since it's kind of open, it's a really good topic because I think even somewhat sophisticated buyers don't really understand the title commitment and the survey, and they just kind of get these documents from the title company which says, we're ensuring that you, the buyer, get title to X property. That's generally what they're saying. But there's a whole schedule of exceptions, and the exceptions say, we are not warranting title if there's an issue with this easement. If we're not warranting title if a neighbor, has a claim on this property. We're not warranting your title as free and clear from a lien from the cable company. And so what happens is you buy the property, you get transition, and then all of a sudden you're the new owner and you get a bill that shows up on your door for $50,000. And it's this cable company that has a lien against the property. It showed up in your title commitment and you didn't do anything. You basically received it, looked at it, and just said okay, and you closed. And then what happens is you owe that $50,000, and you can't go back to the title company and say, oh, I thought I was getting free and clear title. They say, yeah, you are, except for these exceptions that we noted to you, and you didn't object to them because, again, there's a whole sort of things that we do, but whether it's a valid lien, whether it's been paid off, discharged, properly assigned, there's all sorts of things that we can get the title company to basically ensure you that there's no liens. So
they give you that, you contest it, so you make sure the lien is absolutely clear, or you make sure the title is
the property, yeah.
So do you just tell them that, or do you get?
Yeah, we write a letter. We write a letter, and then they respond, and then the seller has a chance to respond, because sometimes the title will say, we're not removing it unless the seller gives us a release. And then the seller will say thumbs up or down. And if they say no, then it's your buyer option to terminate at that time. And this is completely separate, right? This is another thing too. The title and survey objections timeline for terminating a contract is completely separate than your due diligence or independent consideration timeline. So these can either run concurrently, they can run, one can be very long compared to the other, but they're separate. They're completely independent. So even if your due diligence is 30 days and you have a 60-day close, you can have a title problem at day 45 and you can terminate based on title on day 50. So, we have a contract that is written that we can terminate for title 1 day before close. It's really pretty powerful out, and I don't know if our client's going to retrade or do anything, but he has that power, and I guarantee the seller does not realize that their title issues, because they have some title issues that are not, they're small in amount, but there's a lot of hair on it, right? And he doesn't realize that we can terminate because he's negotiating with us like as if we're locked in. And he's saying, you know, I'm not going to do this. But anyway, I say that because it's a big difference. Some people will have that timeline matched up to the due diligence period. Some people have that timeline 15 days from the contract. They say, you know, you get your title commitment, you get your objections in 3 or 4 days, we'll respond to you in 3 days, and then you have to make a decision in 2 days after that. And that's like bam, bam, bam. You've got to be like really on top of it. But then the seller has assurances that you're not going to terminate for title. You may terminate for other reasons in your due diligence period, but you have waived your right to terminate for title in those first 7 or 8, however many days I counted, 10 days. Then your normal contingency is maybe 15. Then they know you're going to close or at least lose your earnest money. So I wasn't going to go into that because it's kind of a very boring topic, and I do my best to try to make it interesting, but the only thing that I can interest you is money. Like these things, I'm serious, they cost you money, and it's not going to be your first deal, hopefully. These types of issues are virtually non-existent in residential, right? Because you get a lot more protections as a homestead or as a owner-occupied or just for residential properties. And so title and survey, they're a lot cleaner. And although sometimes you still have survey issues, right? We get driveway things. We get clients trying to ask us to help them do like driveways or fence boundaries. And so that could happen on a rental house that you buy. But in general, they just don't come up. And so people that if you're coming from residential or you're trying to learn that, these things they're just not a problem. And also the dollar amounts are lower because how much are most rental houses? I don't know, 3, 4, 500,000? Small money. The lien is not going to be like a $150,000 lien from a residential contract. But on a multifamily, it easily can be 6 figures. So are you prepared to spend an extra $100K paying off a lien or paying, I mean, we have lawsuit judgments, we have city disputes. There's all sorts of things that can attach to commercial properties, and they can do it easily, and they can do it, we can trade hands. That's something I think that people don't realize too, is just because a property has traded hands, there's no guarantee that when you get it, it's clean. And then the creditor can pop up when you own it, and you can cry all you want and be like, well, why didn't you tell that guy? Why didn't you tell the last 3 owners? And they say, it doesn't matter. It's our legal right now. We're here for you to pay us. So
you write a letter to the title company.
Yeah.
Test the commitment, and then you say and then you get them to say the title is going to be free of liens or whatever.
Mm-hmm. They remove exceptions. It's called removing exceptions.
Removing exceptions.
Yeah.
And you get the seller to approve.
If it's so there's basically like you send the letter, and then there's 2 categories of people that can fix it. Either the seller can cure or the title can cure. And then they basically just both respond to you about, hey, this is what we're going to do.
If the seller lies about it, then you can sue, right?
How could the seller lie about a lien?
The seller can say there's no lien on the property.
But then the title commitment shows one?
Or if the title doesn't find out.
If the title doesn't find out, then there's usually an exception for unrecorded ones, but you can have them remove it. But think about it, from the title company, how are they supposed to find out? And if it's not, again, that goes back to the PSA as well. You can have a representation that the seller is not aware of any liens that were incurred during their ownership or even prior that they're aware of. Then you can ding them for breach of contract on the other hand around. So there's a lot of ways to catch what you're saying. You can spit all these different scenarios, whether it's recorded, whether it's not recorded, whether the seller knows about it, doesn't know about it. You will be protected based on the PSA. And that's what I think my goal of this is. Eventually, if you guys want to scale, if you want to do lots of deals and bigger deals, you eventually will have to encounter 99% of the scenarios. So you have to build a system and underwriting and understand that, like, it's just hedging. It's kind of like financial investments, right? Everybody would love to make a bet that you guarantee $100 back. And then they say, well, I'll buy insurance that says if this happens, then I'll get $50 back. if this happens, I'll get $75 back. And then they say, okay, 99% of the scenarios now, I get money back. That's basically what you're doing for real estate is I'm buying it, but what if X happens? Okay, well, I have this policy. I have this recourse. What if Y happens? I have this recourse. So that there's no scenario where you're out $100K. The most you'll be out is the insurance policy or maybe legal fees, which are a fraction of the $100K or higher, right? If you're doing a big property, it's like you'll spend $50K on legal fees because what's the worth if you have $1 million, you know, usually they'll have like a mezz debt or they'll have some kind of subordinate lender that just made a $2 million loan and never got paid off. You get dinged for $2 million and you have to have recourse against either the seller or the title company. So that really kind of covers some of these two items that I would say are really, really important. Lease underwriting, read the lease, understand it, do an abstract of it, because when you're buying commercial real estate, when you're buying any of these properties, you're buying a series of cash flows. The lease is what dictates that cash flow, and it's really important for you to understand what are the circumstances that the tenant can either terminate the lease, what can they reduce their rent, what can they, you know, or how much do they have to pay in rent? What's the best scenario for me as a landlord? So leases are critical, and then underwriting NOI is, you know, is just critical. And if you don't have that ability, it's okay. But partner with somebody that does, because I see a lot of very successful syndicators or just real estate investors. They know what their skill is, and maybe they're a people person. Maybe they can get people to commit money, but they're not a numbers person, and that's okay. But if your partner is doing the underwriting and they do acquisitions, that's okay. You do investor relations, you bring the money, and you know maybe you talk to contractors, whatever. But that's kind of the end goal of this. But so much to cover. You know, debt. I was going to talk about debt financing. It's your biggest financial partner in most cases, even if you're doing 60%, 55% low LTV. Your debt is your biggest partner, and so commercial real estate is basically debt financing and purchase price. And if you manage those two things, you almost can't do it wrong. But so next up, we're going to go to my warehouse, which is kind of cool. It's a triple net property, very close, 5 minutes. I think everybody has the address. And we can all drive there. There's a big parking lot, and it would be short. I don't know how interesting it is for you guys. It's just kind of warehouse, but I'll open the door and we walk in and can kind of look at some of the tenants. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Talk about like acquisition process, like for that.
Yeah. So that's a great plug for my YouTube channel because
The next video over there, right?
one of my most popular videos is a walkthrough. So I did a video where I talk about the purchase price. I talk about the exit. I talk about what makes that property unique. It's in Plano, but yeah. So I'm happy to talk about that up there. And then when you look at it, you'll kind of get a sense of warehouse. It's great. They're the easiest tenant base. They never complain about anything. Only if things are like the gate is broken. That's the only thing they complain about.
What is it, triple net? There's a possibility for that?
It's complicated, but I can explain that when we get up there. So, yeah, sure.
All right.
Thank you so much.